In the heart of 1930s Chicago, amidst the gray tapestry of the Great Depression, there stood a beacon of crimson hope, Finch's Quality Meats. While other storefronts were shuttered and bread lines stretched for blocks, a different kind of queue formed daily before Mr. Finch's establishment. It was a line of weary faces, of mothers with hollowed eyes and fathers with threadbare coats, all drawn by the promise of something almost mythical in those lean years, a perfect cut of meat. The shop itself was an anomaly of cleanliness and order in a world succumbing to decay. Its polished windows reflected a city starved for sustenance, yet inside, a quiet, meticulous man offered a reprieve from the gnawing hunger. To the residents of Packingtown, Alistair Finch was not merely a butcher, he was a minor saint, a provider whose supply of prime beef and pork seemed miraculously immune to the economic desolation that had consumed everything else. The camera of history, were it to pan inside, would linger on the refrigerated display case, a glass and steel altar upon which rested the objects of the city's desire. The steaks were things of impossible beauty, their flesh a deep, rich ruby, marbled with veins of pristine white fat. The roasts were substantial, promising a rare family meal that wasn't stretched with potatoes and watery broth. Neighbors would whisper their praises, marveling at the consistent quality, the unparalleled texture that melted in the mouth. In an era where gristle and bone were common fare, Finch's products were a luxury that felt almost sinful. No one questioned its origin. In a city where survival was the only commandment, a gift of such profound quality was not to be interrogated. It was simply to be accepted, cooked and savored, a fleeting moment of abundance in an ocean of want. Presiding over this small kingdom of flesh was Mr. Alistair Finch himself, a man of middle years, with a soft voice and movements as precise as his filleting knife. He was the very picture of quiet professionalism. Clad always in a spotless white apron, he served his customers with a spare, almost melancholic smile, weighing each cut with the focused attention of a master craftsman. He was a widower, a detail that added a touch of tragedy to his otherwise impeccable public image, making him a figure of both respect and sympathy. He was a pillar of the community, a man who seemed to take his civic duty to feed the hungry with the utmost seriousness. He was kind, he was reliable, and his shop was a sanctuary of order. But behind his calm, unassuming eyes, a different kind of ledger was being kept. A chillingly pragmatic accounting of supply and demand that operated on a logic all its own. Decades fade into a montage of urban change, and the camera now shows us the same street corner, but it is a place transformed by neglect and time. Finch's Quality Meats mom is no longer a beacon but a scar. The windows are boarded over, the wood warped and grayed by countless seasons of rain and snow. The once proud sign is gone, the brick facade now a canvas for layers of spray-painted graffiti. Each tag a meaningless scrawl over a history too dark to be remembered clearly. The building exudes a palpable sense of wrongness, an architectural silence that seems to absorb the sounds of the bustling modern city around it. It is a place the neighborhood has decided to forget, a derelict monument to an unspeakable chapter in its past. The air around it still feels heavy, as if the very ground is saturated with the memory of what transpired within those walls. Yet, some stories refuse to be buried. On a crisp autumn evening, a group of teenagers stand before the decaying storefront, their nervous laughter echoing in the twilight. It is a local rite of passage, a dare passed down through generations. One of them, prodded by his friends, inches toward the rotting doorframe, his hand outstretched as if to touch a relic in a cursed tomb. They whisper the name that has haunted this block for nearly a century, a name that has become a local boogeyman, a cautionary tale to frighten children into behaving. The name they speak is not Alistair Finch, the kind butcher. It is a more fearsome title, one forged in horror and disbelief, a name that still carries the faint, sweet odor of decay, the butcher of Packingtown. For them, it is just a ghost story, a thrilling piece of local folklore. The line between folklore and historical fact is often blurred, written in the faded ink of police reports and the sensational headlines of old newspapers. Legends like that of the butcher of Packingtown do not spring from nothingness. They are born from a truth so monstrous that it must be softened into a fable to be digestible. They become ghost stories because the alternative, that a man could commit such atrocities in plain sight, celebrated by his unknowing community, is a far more terrifying reality to confront. Our investigation begins here by peeling back the layers of myth to expose the bone-chilling chronicle beneath. We will consult the archives, the official records, and the hushed testimonies that survived to reconstruct the grim reality of what happened inside a butcher shop that offered salvation at an unthinkable price. This legend is an echo that endures to this day, a chilling reminder that the deepest darkness can hide behind the most ordinary of facades. And since these stories travel through time and space, tell us in the comments from which city you are joining us in this investigation and the exact time your journey into this archive begins. With your presence now marked in our records, let us return to the grim autumn of 1934. We will not look at the legend, but at the man. We will examine the first subtle cracks that appeared in the perfect, clean facade of Mr. Alistair Finch, and uncover the moment a young apprentice's suspicion began to curdle into a certainty too horrifying to comprehend. To the young apprentice, Leo, the world outside Finch's quality meats was a chaotic symphony of desperation and decay, but the shop itself was a sanctuary of purpose and order. His days fell into a comforting rhythm, governed by the meticulous standards of his mentor. He would arrive before dawn to the sharp, clean scent of bleach, his first task always to sweep the night's dust and scatter fresh sawdust across the floorboards. He learned to polish the glass of the display case until it was an invisible barrier between the hungry public and the pristine cuts within. Under Mr. Finch's watchful eye, Leo practiced the fundamentals of the trade: how to sharpen a knife to a razor's edge, the proper way to break down a side of pork, and the patient art of trimming fat to achieve the perfect balance. For an orphan who had known only uncertainty, this disciplined world was a gift, and he regarded Alistair Finch with a reverence bordering on devotion. Mr. Finch was a demanding teacher, his praise as spare as the smiles he offered his customers. Every lesson was delivered in his soft, even-toned voice, yet it carried the unyielding weight of command. "Precision is a form of respect, Leo," he would often say, guiding the boy's hand as he learned to separate muscle from bone. "We respect the animal by wasting nothing. We respect the customer by offering only the best." This philosophy permeated every corner of the establishment. Every surface was scrubbed raw, every tool cleaned and oiled at the end of each day. Finch's movements were economical and precise, a ballet of quiet efficiency. To Leo, his boss was the embodiment of professionalism, a man who had carved out a bastion of integrity amidst the city's collapse. He could not yet see the cold, pragmatic void that lay beneath this veneer of dignified craftsmanship, a chilling philosophy of utility that extended far beyond the sides of beef and pork. The delicate equilibrium of Leo's world first began to tremble with the quiet disappearance of a man the neighborhood called One Shoe, Jimmy. Jimmy was a fixture, a harmless derelict who haunted the alley behind the bakery, known for his lopsided gait and the tattered wool coat he wore even in the oppressive summer heat. He was one of the city's ghosts, visible only at the periphery of daily life. One week, he was there, humming a tuneless song. The next, he was simply gone. His absence was not a sudden tear in the social fabric, but a slow, silent fraying at the edges that most people were too preoccupied to notice. In a city where thousands were unmoored, one more drifting soul was of little consequence. But Leo had often given the man scraps at the end of the day, and the sudden, complete silence from the alley felt unnatural, a void where a small, familiar piece of the world used to be. A few days after Jimmy had vanished from his usual post, Leo gathered the courage to mention it to his employer while cleaning the large butcher block. "Funny, I haven't seen One Shoe Jimmy around lately," he remarked, trying to sound casual. Mr. Finch didn't look up from the knife he was sharpening, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the momentary silence. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice devoid of any curiosity or concern. "In this city, people come and go, Leo. They are like leaves in the wind." He set the knife down and met the boy's gaze, his eyes calm and unreadable, especially those with nowhere to land. The statement was delivered as a simple, undeniable fact, but its finality was chilling. It wasn't just an observation, it was a dismissal, a quiet closing of a ledger on a life that, in Finch's view, had already been discarded by the world. It was then that Leo began to notice the inviolable ritual of Tuesday nights. While most businesses were shuttered by 6, Mr. Finch would lock the front door at precisely 5 o'clock every Tuesday, pulling down the heavy green blinds to seal the shop off from the street. He would instruct Leo to finish his cleaning and leave, always with a polite but firm, "I have some special preparations to attend to this evening. I'll handle the closing myself." A low, mechanical hum, the distinct growl of the electric bone saw, would often emanate from the back room long into the night. This weekly seclusion was peculiar enough, but it was accompanied by a strict, unspoken rule. On Wednesday mornings, Leo was absolutely forbidden from entering the walk-in freezer. The door, usually accessible for stocking, would be locked, a boundary the apprentice knew he must never cross. The consequence of this secret Tuesday labor would be revealed every Wednesday morning, laid out like jewels upon crushed ice. This was when the Finch's specials appeared in the display case. They were cuts of a quality and marbling that seemed impossible, their flesh a deep, vibrant crimson that made the standard beef and pork look pale and mundane in comparison. They were roasts of a perfect uniform size and steaks of an unparalleled thickness and tenderness. When customers asked what they were, Mr. Finch would simply smile and call them his house blend, a special purchase from a private supplier out in the country. The explanation was accepted without question. In a time of such desperate need, no one interrogated a miracle. They simply paid their coin, took their parcel wrapped in clean butcher paper, and hurried home to grant their families a rare and sumptuous feast. The prohibition on entering the freezer on Wednesdays became a source of growing dread for Leo. Mr. Finch's excuses were always plausible. "Just finished a thorough cleaning. The floor is dangerously slick," he'd say one week. "I've reorganized the inventory, and I don't want my system disturbed," he'd offer the next. But Leo could feel the cold air seep from beneath the heavy insulated door, and with it came a faint, unfamiliar scent. It was a subtle, sweetish odor, almost cloying, that was quickly overwhelmed by the shop's usual metallic and chemical smells but lingered in the back of his throat. The freezer, once just a cold space for storage, began to feel like a vault, a locked chamber guarding a secret that seemed to radiate a palpable chill. A coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature within. This strange, sweet undertone was becoming a more persistent presence. Leo started to notice it clinging to the air in the back room, particularly around the large cast-iron floor drain. Mr. Finch was obsessive about cleanliness, daily sluicing the concrete floors with bleach and hot water until they gleamed. Yet, this faint, sickly sweet odor would always return, a ghostly scent that the harsh chemicals could not entirely vanquish. It was not the familiar smell of animal fat or old blood. It was something else, something deeply organic and unsettlingly intimate. He would sometimes catch a whiff of it on Mr. Finch's own apron after a long Tuesday night of solitary work. The smell was a quiet, insidious question mark hanging in the air, a sensory detail that didn't fit within the meticulously ordered world of the butcher shop. Leo found himself trapped in a disquieting internal conflict. Every rational part of his mind sought to dismiss these mounting inconsistencies. Mr. Finch had saved him from a life on the streets, given him a trade bien and provided him with a stability he had never known. Gratitude warred with a primal sense of unease. He told himself that his mentor was simply a shrewd businessman, perhaps skirting some regulations or dealing with black market suppliers to survive. The late nights, the locked freezer, the strange smells, these were surely just the necessary, unsavory components of keeping a business afloat in the depths of the Great Depression. To suspect the man he so admired of something more sinister felt like a profound betrayal. He tried to ignore the gnawing suspicion, to focus on his work, and to believe in the kind, respectable butcher the rest of the city saw. One Wednesday afternoon, as the last of the special cuts was sold to a grateful young mother, Leo watched Mr. Finch wrap the meat with his customary care. The butcher smiled his sad, gentle smile at the woman's child, even offering the boy a small piece of jerky. The scene was a perfect tableau of community and charity, the very image of the man who was keeping Packingtown fed. Yet, as Leo watched, a cold certainty began to crystallize in his gut, overriding all his desperate rationalizations. He was watching a predator who had perfected his camouflage, a wolf tending to the flock. The kindness in his mentor's eyes seemed suddenly hollow, a meticulously crafted mask. The question that had been lurking in the shadows of his mind now stepped into the light, stark and terrifying. Mr. Finch was feeding the hungry, yes, but with what? The fragile peace in Leo's mind was shattered on a Thursday night. 2 weeks after the flower girl had vanished from her post by the church, Mr. Finch had departed for the evening, leaving the apprentice to complete the final, exhaustive cleaning ritual. The shop was a tomb of silence, broken only by the rhythmic scrape of Leo's stiff-bristled brush against the concrete floor of the back room. He worked with a frantic energy, a desperate attempt to scrub away the unease that had taken root in his soul. The air was thick with the acrid scent of bleach, a chemical veil that failed to completely mask the persistent sickly sweet undertone emanating from the large, cast-iron drain in the center of the floor. It was a smell that now haunted his sleep, a phantom scent he could almost taste at the back of his throat. He felt an inexplicable compulsion to focus his efforts there, as if the drain itself held the answer to the questions he was too terrified to form into words. Mr. Finch had taught him that the drain was the heart of the shop's hygiene, a potential source of corruption that must be relentlessly purged. Leo had followed this instruction with religious zeal, but tonight felt different. He poured a bucket of scalding water down the grate, followed by a caustic flood of lye, watching the chemical foam and sizzle. As he scrubbed inside the basin with a long-handled brush, he felt it catch on something unyielding. It was not the usual soft resistance of accumulated fat or gristle. This was a hard, sharp snag. Cursing under his breath, he knelt, the cold dampness of the concrete seeping through his trousers. He reached into the greasy, opaque water of the trap, his fingers recoiling from the foul, slimy texture of the pipe's interior. He felt around in the cold muck, his mind bracing for the unpleasantness of a bone fragment. But what his fingers closed around was small, flat, and distinctly inorganic. He pulled his hand back into the dim light of the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Cradled in his palm, coated in a disgusting film of grease and grime, was a small, circular object. He carried it to the deep utility sink, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs with a strange, premonitory dread. He turned on the cold water tap and rinsed the object, rubbing it clean with his trembling thumb. As the filth washed away, an ethereal, pearlescent luster was revealed. It was a button, no larger than his thumbnail, carved from mother of pearl. Its delicate, iridescent surface shimmered softly, a thing of fragile beauty utterly alien to this grim, functional space of blood and steel. It was a detail from another world, a piece of a life that had no business being in the gut of a butcher shop's floor drain, a place where only waste and remnants were meant to go. A wave of ice-cold recognition washed over him, so potent it made him gasp for air. He knew this button. He had seen it countless times, a single point of light on a drab canvas of poverty. It belonged to Eliza, a frail young woman with haunted eyes who sold wilting flowers near the steps of Old St. Mary's Cathedral. She was one of the city's forgotten specters, a soul so peripheral that her presence was barely registered. But Leo had noticed her. He had noticed the threadbare gray coat she wore against the biting Chicago wind, and he had specifically noticed the single, elegant mother-of-pearl button fastened at her collar, a lonely piece of finery that seemed to hold the entire shabby garment together. It was her one small, defiant claim to dignity in a world that had afforded her none. The timeline of her disappearance now slammed into his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't seen Eliza at her usual spot for nearly 2 weeks. Her absence had been a quiet void, another small, sad subtraction from the city's desperate equation, easily overlooked amidst the daily struggle for survival. He now realized with sickening clarity that the last time he had seen her was on a Tuesday morning. She had been standing across the street, looking toward the butcher shop with a hopeful, hungry expression. He had been busy and had turned away. Now the memory was an indictment. Tuesday, the day of Mr. Finch's secret, solitary work, the day before the choicest, special cuts would appear in the display case, their flesh an unnaturally deep and vibrant shade of crimson. The connection was no longer a suspicion. It was a screaming, undeniable certainty. The button in his palm felt impossibly heavy, a condensed sphere of pure horror. It was irrefutable proof that Eliza had not simply vanished from the streets. She had been brought into this room, Not through the front door as a customer, but into the back, the inner sanctum of disassembly where carcasses were processed. The very floor he was standing on, scrubbed clean with such obsessive care, was not just a workspace. It was a stage for an unspeakable act. Every meticulous detail of Mr. Finch's routine, once a source of comfort and order, now reassembled itself in Leo's mind into a monstrous mosaic of methodical butchery. The locked freezer was not for protecting inventory, it was for hiding it. The whine of the bone saw on Tuesday nights was not for pork or beef. The sweet smell was not from spoilage, it was the smell of her. A violent shudder racked his body. He stumbled back from the drain, his eyes darting around the room that had, for a year, been his sanctuary. It was now a cage, a meticulously clean abattoir. The rows of gleaming knives on their magnetic rack were no longer tools of a trade, but instruments of a horrifying transformation. The heavy meat hooks, hanging empty from the ceiling rails, seemed to sway with the weight of unseen bodies. The entire establishment, from its welcoming facade to this sterile back room, was a lie. It was a perfectly designed trap, built by a predator who wore the mask of a savior. Mr. Alistair Finch, the quiet, kind pillar of the community, the man who was feeding the hungry, was a monster of an order Leo could not have conceived. His kindness was the bait, his shop the snare, and his cleaver the final, terrible punchline. He quickly, almost furtively, pocketed the mother-of-pearl button. The smooth, cool object felt like a burning coal against his leg, a sacred relic and a piece of damning evidence. He had to get out. The instinct to flee was overwhelming, a primal scream in his mind telling him to run and never look back. But where could he go? He was an orphan with nothing and no one. And who would believe such a monstrous story against the word of a man as respected as Mr. Finch? The authorities would dismiss him as a delusional, ungrateful boy. The thought of Mr. Finch's calm, unreadable eyes, the quiet authority in his voice, paralyzed him. The butcher's influence was woven into the fabric of the neighborhood. To accuse him would be to accuse the community of a willful blindness they would never admit to. But the image of Eliza's face, thin and hopeful, and the solid reality of the button in his pocket, forged a new, terrible resolve in the crucible of his fear. Flight was not enough. Leaving would allow the cycle to continue, allowing another one-shoe Jimmy or another Eliza to become Wednesday's special. The horror was too vast to be simply escaped. It had to be exposed. He could not face Mr. Finch. Not yet. He needed more than a single, misplaced button. He needed definitive, undeniable proof that would shatter the butcher's benevolent facade beyond any hope of repair. His gaze drifted toward the small, mob-cluttered office at the back of the shop, where Mr. Finch spent his evenings poring over his ledgers. The heavy oak desk, always kept locked, was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a vault. A cold, grim purpose began to settle over him, displacing the initial panic. He was no longer just an apprentice caught in a terrifying situation. He was the sole keeper of a truth so dark it threatened to swallow the entire city block. His mission had changed. It was no longer about learning a trade or earning his keep. It was about unearthing the full scope of the atrocity that transpired within these four walls. He had to get inside that desk. He had to find the records, the cold, factual accounting of this madness that he knew, with a bone-deep certainty, a man as meticulous as Alistair Finch would keep. The coming days would be a perilous performance, a tightrope walk of feigned normalcy over a chasm of mortal terror. He would have to continue his duties, smile at his mentor, and wait for the perfect moment to uncover the butcher's secret diary of the dead. The days that followed Leo's discovery were an exercise in masterful, soul-crushing deception. He moved through his duties with the automated precision of a clockwork figure, his hands performing the familiar tasks of sweeping sawdust, polishing glass, and sharpening knives, while his mind screamed from within a silent, soundproof chamber of horror. Every corner of the shop, once a source of stability and pride, had transformed into a piece of a monstrous stage set. The gleaming meat hooks seemed to anticipate a different kind of weight, and the deep, resonant thud of Mr. Finch's cleaver on the butcher block now sounded less like preparation and more like a final, percussive punctuation to a life. He had to maintain his composure, to mirror the calm, placid surface of his mentor, knowing that beneath both their facades, a terrible secret was festering, waiting for a single crack to erupt into view. The performance was exhausting, a constant, draining battle against the hysteria clawing at the edges of his sanity. Alistair Finch, a man attuned to the subtlest details of his trade, was not oblivious to the change. He observed the boy with a new, unnerving intensity. The shift was almost imperceptible to an outsider. A slight tremor in Leo's hand as he passed a knife, a fleeting moment of hesitation before he answered a question, a tendency to stare at the floor drain when he thought no one was looking. Finch's previously paternal demeanor began to acquire a sharp, menacing edge, hidden beneath the same soft-spoken veneer. His questions, once instructional, became probes. "You seem distracted, Leo. Is something troubling your mind?" he would ask, his voice a silken thread of concern that felt more like a tightening wire. The shop, which had once been a refuge from the chaos of the city, was rapidly shrinking, its four walls pressing in on Leo until it felt less like a workplace and more like a meticulously clean, inescapable cage. The focus of Leo's terror and his desperate hope for confirmation became the heavy oak desk in the small, windowless office. It was Mr. Finch's private domain, a place where he retired each evening to meticulously update his accounts. Leo had often seen him at work under the green-shaded lamp, his pen scratching across the pages of a large, leather-bound ledger. The apprentice now saw the desk not as a piece of furniture, but as a sarcophagus, a repository of unspeakable truths. The button was a damning accusation, but it was not enough. He needed the cold, undeniable arithmetic of the crime. He needed the butcher's own hand to provide the testimony. He began to study the lock on the desk drawer, a simple but sturdy brass mechanism. He studied Mr. Finch's habits, noting when he left for his brief supper, the precise minutes he was away from the office, calculating the razor-thin margin of opportunity he might have to unearth the proof. His chance came on a Tuesday, a day already thick with dread. Mr. Finch was preparing for his solitary evening ritual, the air already humming with a low, anticipatory tension. A delivery of rock salt had been delayed, forcing the butcher to make a rare trip to the warehouse district just before closing. "Keep an eye on the front, Leo. I'll not be more than an hour," Finch instructed, his voice as even as ever. But his eyes lingered on the boy for a moment too long, a silent warning against transgression. The moment the door clicked shut behind his mentor, a profound and terrifying silence descended upon the shop. It was the silence of a tomb, broken only by the frantic, percussive beat of Leo's own heart. The hour Finch had given him was a lifetime, and no time at all, a window of opportunity that was also a closing trap. He knew this was his only chance. With trembling hands and a set of crude tools he had fashioned from stiff wire and a bent nail file, Leo approached the office. Every creak of the floorboards under his feet was a cannon shot in the oppressive silence. He knelt before the desk, the smell of lemon polish and old paper filling his nostrils, a mundane scent that seemed obscene in its normalcy. He inserted the wire into the lock, his fingers clumsy with fear and adrenaline. He had practiced on similar locks on discarded furniture in the alley, but this felt different. This was a violation of a sacred, monstrous space. The metallic clicks and scrapes seemed to echo through the entire building as he manipulated the tumblers, his breath held tight in his chest. He imagined Finch returning early, the quiet turn of the key in the front door, the calm, questioning voice asking what he was doing. The thought almost made him abandon the attempt entirely. Then, with a soft, definitive clink, the lock gave way. The sound was both a victory and a death knell. He pulled the drawer open with excruciating slowness, revealing a space of perfect obsessive order. There were neat stacks of invoices, receipts, and a small tin of ink pens, and beneath them, a single, imposing volume, a thick ledger bound in dark green leather, identical to the one Finch used for his legitimate business accounts, but with no label on its spine. It felt cold to the touch, unnaturally so, as if it had absorbed the chill from the walk-in freezer. He lifted it from the drawer, its weight feeling immense, disproportionate to its size. This was it, the documentary evidence, the secret history of Finch's quality meats, written in the precise, elegant script of a meticulous monster. He placed it on the desk, the leather cover seeming to absorb the light from the dim bulb above. He opened the book, The first several pages contained what appeared to be standard inventory notes, detailing shipments of beef sides and whole pigs from suppliers Leo had never heard of, all listed under remote, rural addresses. It seemed, for a terrifying moment, that his suspicions were just a paranoid fantasy born of grief and stress. But then he turned a page and the format changed. The entries were no longer listed by animal. Instead, they were designated by a chillingly detached physical description, followed by a precise weight and a date. His eyes scanned the page, his mind struggling to process the cold, bureaucratic horror laid out before him. The neat columns and tidy script were a grotesque parody of accounting, a system designed to quantify and process human life as if it were mere livestock, a chilling testament to a mind that had erased the line between person and product. The entry that made his blood run cold was dated 2 weeks prior, the day after Eliza, the flower girl, had last been seen. The script was as clear and steady as any other. It read, "Gray coat, pearl button, 112 LOBs." The weight was appallingly slight, the description a brutal, summary dismissal of a human being. Below it, another entry from a month before caught his eye, coinciding with the disappearance of the neighborhood derelict. Tattered overcoat, 1 shoe, 158 lbs. It was a secret diary of the dead, a meticulous record of a hidden production line. Each entry was a ghost, a vanished soul from the city's periphery, their entire existence reduced to a brief, physical descriptor and a number representing their yield. He felt a wave of nausea so profound, he had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. The sweet, cloying smell in the shop suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. He flipped through the pages, his horror mounting with each entry. The ledger went back years. Red hair, freckles, 119 lbs. Factory soot, cuff, 137 lbs. Limping gait, cane, 165 lbs. Dozens of entries, dozens of forgotten people, their final moments catalogued with the dispassionate precision of a botanist classifying specimens. He saw the dates, and a pattern emerged with sickening clarity. Each entry was logged on a Tuesday. The subsequent pages detailed the yields from these acquisitions, with notes on the quality and texture of the resulting product. Mr. Finch wasn't just a murderer, he was an artisan of the abattoir, a craftsman applying the principles of his trade to a new, unspeakable raw material. The praised Finch's specials were not a miracle of supply, but the result of a monstrous, sustainable harvest. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Alistair Finch had been conducting this grim business for years, operating under the very noses of the community he was feeding. He had perfected a system of acquisition, processing, and distribution that was terrifyingly efficient. He preyed on the invisible, the people society had already discarded, their disappearances creating no ripples, their absences unnoticed in the vast ocean of the city's misery. He was a predator who had identified the perfect camouflage, the guise of a benevolent provider. He was not just feeding the hungry, he was solving a problem of his own grim design, turning the city's human surplus into a coveted commodity. The ledger was a testament to a profound and chillingly pragmatic madness, a philosophy of ultimate, horrifying utility. Suddenly, a sound from the front of the shop, the distinct scrape of a key turning in the lock. Finch was back. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Leo. He had been so absorbed in the ledger's hideous contents that he had lost all track of time. He slammed the book shut, his mind racing. There was no time to return it to the drawer and relock it. He shoved the heavy volume under his apron, the book's hard spine pressing into his stomach like a block of ice. He slid the drawer shut just as he heard the front door swing open, its little bell announcing the butcher's return with a sound that had once been welcoming but was now the toll of a death knell. He had the proof, but he was trapped, cornered in the monster's lair with the evidence of his crimes held tight against his own body. He stumbled out of the office, trying to compose his features into a mask of normalcy. Alistair Finch stood by the counter, slowly unbuttoning his overcoat. He did not look at Leo immediately. Instead, his gaze swept the shop, a silent, meticulous inventory. His eyes seemed to linger for a fraction of a second on the office door before finally settling on his apprentice. A slow, spare smile touched Finch's lips, but it did not reach his eyes. His eyes were cold, flat, and analytical. They seemed to see the unnatural bulge under Leo's apron, the frantic pulse beating in the boy's throat. "Everything in order, Leo?" he asked, his voice a soft, dangerous whisper that carried the finality of a closing cage door. The question hung in the air, not as a greeting, but as an accusation. The butcher shop, now cast in the long shadows of the late afternoon, became a courtroom and an execution chamber all in one. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken knowledge. Leo could feel the weight of the ledger against him, a cold, damning slab of truth. Mr. Finch took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate, like a predator closing the final distance on its prey. The paternal mask had fallen away completely, replaced by a look of chillingly calm appraisal. He knew. In that single, terrifying moment of eye contact, Leo understood that Finch knew he had discovered the secret. The investigation was over. The time for pretense had passed. Now, in the heart of the abattoir, the final, bloody lesson of the trade was about to begin. The cage was locked, and the butcher was holding the key. Leo's mind was a maelstrom of terror and adrenaline, his every instinct screaming at him to flee. But his feet felt as if they were nailed to the sawdust-covered floor. He looked past Mr. Finch, toward the front door and the fading light of the outside world, which now seemed a million miles away. The mundane sounds of the city, a distant streetcar, the laughter of children playing, were echoes from a life he was no longer a part of. His reality had contracted to this single, terrifying space, defined by the rows of gleaming knives on the wall and the calm, appraising stare of the man who had been his savior and was now his captor. The weight of the ledger was a constant reminder of the dozens of lives that had ended in this room, their final testimonies pressed against his own trembling flesh. He was no longer just an apprentice. He was the archive of the dead. Mr. Finch began to walk slowly toward the back of the shop, not looking at Leo but clearly expecting him to follow. It was an unspoken command, a silent summons to the inner sanctum where the real work was done. Each step Finch took was measured and unhurried, the quiet confidence of a man in total control of his environment. He picked up a freshly sharpened cleaver from the magnetic rack, testing its edge with his thumb, the gesture both casual and deeply menacing. "There are some aspects of the trade I have not yet shown you, Leo," he said, his voice still unnervingly soft. "The most important lessons, about waste, about purpose." He was no longer speaking to an apprentice, but to an accomplice, or perhaps to the next piece of inventory. The distinction had become terrifyingly unclear. The air was saturated with the chemical sharpness of bleach, a scent Leo now understood as the smell of erasure. It was the smell of secrets being scrubbed into oblivion, of evidence being sluiced down the drain. He followed Finch toward the back room, each step a conscious act of will against the paralytic fear that threatened to consume him. He was walking into the very heart of the horror, the processing floor where the names in the ledger had been transformed into the specials in the display case. The low mechanical hum of the refrigeration unit was the only sound, a monotonous drone that seemed to be counting down his final seconds. The butcher's shadow loomed large on the tiled wall, a monstrous silhouette brandishing a blade of polished steel. The moment of discovery had passed, and the moment of consequence had arrived with a chilling, silent finality. In that moment, Leo understood the terrible symbiosis that had existed in Packingtown. The community, in its desperation, had chosen not to see. They had accepted the miracle of Finch's meat without question, their willful blindness a form of passive complicity that had allowed this horror to flourish. They were hungry, and Mr. Finch fed them. The simple, brutal transaction had masked an atrocity of unimaginable proportions. The ledger in his possession was not just an indictment of one man. It was a dark mirror held up to a society willing to look away from the inconvenient disappearances of its most vulnerable members. The butcher was a monster born not in a vacuum, but in the fertile soil of collective indifference. He was a symptom of the city's deeper sickness. The finality of his situation settled upon him not with a bang, but with a quiet, cold dread. He had sought the truth, and now the truth had cornered him. The ledger, which he had risked everything to obtain, was now the very thing that sealed his fate. Its discovery had transformed him from a potential threat into an undeniable liability that a man as meticulous as Alistair Finch could not afford. As he crossed the threshold into the back room, the heavy, insulated door to the walk-in freezer loomed before him like the entrance to a crypt. He knew that whatever happened next, the story of Finch's quality meats would not end with him. The only question was whether he would be its final chronicler or simply its final entry. The silence that descended upon the butcher shop was a physical entity, a heavy, suffocating blanket that absorbed all sound. Leo stood frozen, the ledger a cold, rectangular tumor beneath his apron, its damning weight a constant, terrifying pressure against his stomach. Alistair Finch did not move from his position by the counter, his overcoat now hanging from a hook, revealing the pristine white apron beneath. His gaze was not one of rage or surprise, but of a profound, almost weary disappointment, the look of a master craftsman whose prized tool has revealed a fatal flaw. The soft, melancholic smile was gone, replaced by a placid mask of appraisal. He had not caught Leo in the act of theft, but in the act of understanding. The time for deception had evaporated, leaving only the cold, hard truth hanging between them in the shadow-filled air, as sharp and tangible as one of Finch's own filleting knives. Finch was the first to break the unbearable stillness, his voice maintaining its characteristic softness, a tone utterly incongruous with the monstrous reality it was about to confirm. "I'd hoped you would be different, Leo," he began, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "I thought you, of all people, would appreciate the elegance of a closed system, the beauty of true efficiency." He gestured vaguely at the display case, where the last of the day's cuts rested under the dim electric light. "This city is a monument to waste. It discards everything: buildings, food, opportunities, people. It casts them aside to rot in the gutters, to serve no purpose but to starve. I saw not waste, but potential. I saw a resource being squandered." His confession was not an admission of guilt, but the opening of a lecture, a chillingly rational explanation of a grotesque economic theory. He began to walk towards the back room, his steps measured and calm, a silent command for Leo to follow. "Society is a butcher, boy, but a clumsy, inefficient one. It makes the cut, but it throws away the best meat," Finch continued, his voice echoing slightly in the tiled space. "It deems some lives worthless, surplus to requirements. I simply disagreed with their assessment." He paused by the large butcher block, running a hand over its scarred wooden surface. "I waste nothing. That has always been my guiding principle. Society threw them on the scrap heap, so I did what any sensible man would do. I recycled them. I took the discarded and I gave them a purpose. I took the hungry and I made them the meal. I fed families. I provided a service. What part of that is so difficult to comprehend?" The words washed over Leo, each one a drop of ice water on his soul. This was not the raving of a madman, but the cold, articulated philosophy of a monster who believed himself a pragmatist. The names in the ledger, tattered overcoat, red hair, freckles, were not trophies of a killer, but entries in an inventory log, a meticulous accounting of raw materials acquired for processing. He understood now that Finch's mind was a closed, perfect loop of horrifying logic, a place where the concepts of morality and humanity had been excised like so much gristle and bone. The butcher saw himself not as a predator, but as a vital, if misunderstood, part of the urban ecosystem, a scavenger who tidied up society's failures and turned them into a valuable, life-sustaining commodity. The sheer, unadulterated sanity of his madness was the most terrifying thing of all. As they reached the heavy, insulated door of the walk-in freezer, Finch produced a small key from his pocket. The air around the door was palpably cold, carrying with it that faint, sickly sweet odor that Leo now recognized with sickening certainty. "You have been a good apprentice, Leo," Finch said, his hand resting on the large metal latch. "And you learned to clean, to cut, to prepare. But you cannot truly understand this trade until you understand the nature of the product from its very beginning. You must respect the raw material." He turned the key, and the lock clicked open with a sound of profound finality. It was the sound of a tomb being unsealed, the sound of the last door of denial being thrown open to reveal the abattoir's innermost sanctum, a place where the line between the provider and the provided for was irrevocably erased. Finch pulled the heavy door open, and a cloud of frigid, vaporous air billowed out, carrying the smell of cold metal and something else, something deeply, primally unsettling. The interior was dimly lit by a single encaged bulb, its weak yellow light casting long, dancing shadows. At first, the scene was one of familiar order. To the left hung 2 sides of beef, their flesh dark and marbled. To the right, 3 whole pigs, pale and clean, waited on large steel hooks. The scene was a perfect and sterile tableau of the butcher's trade, a testament to the clean, efficient process that fed the neighborhood. But it was the space in the center, directly under the faint glow of the light, that drew the eye and shattered the illusion of normalcy, revealing the true, unspeakable nature of the Finch's specials. Hanging from a large hook, suspended by its ankles in the same manner as the animal carcasses beside it, was the body of a man. He was clad in the simple, worn clothes of a laborer, his face pale and slack in the frozen air. The body was pristine, unmarked, treated with the same meticulous care as any other piece of meat destined for the display case. It was not a scene of chaotic violence, but one of cold, industrial processing. The man was no longer a person, he was inventory. He was the next special purchase from the country, the next house blend. The sight was a violation of all natural law, a quiet, methodical horror that was far more disturbing than any frenzied act of butchery could ever be. It was the final, irrefutable proof of Finch's philosophy, hung on a hook for inspection. Leo recognized him. He was a dock worker, a man with a booming laugh and a perpetually tired face whom he had seen in the shop just 2 days prior, haggling over the price of pork chops for his family. The memory of the man's laughter, of his tired, kind eyes, collided with the silent, inverted reality hanging before him, and something inside Leo broke. The ledger pressed against him, no longer just a book but a tombstone for this man and all the others. This was the source of the sweet smell. This was the secret of the Tuesday night work. This was the final, terrible destination for the city's forgotten souls, a place where their last vestiges of humanity were stripped away, leaving only flesh and bone to be weighed, cut, and sold by the pound. The transaction was complete. Finch seemed entirely unfazed by the sight, regarding the hanging body with the dispassionate eye of a connoisseur assessing a prize-winning steer. "A fine specimen," he commented, his voice a low murmur in the frigid air. "Strong, well-fed. The quality will be exceptional. There will be very little waste." He stepped fully into the freezer, the cold air preserving his words like insects in amber. He ran a hand along the man's leg, his touch purely professional, assessing texture and density. "This is the final lesson, Leo. To see beyond the sentimentality, beyond the illusion of the individual, and to see only the utility, to see the purpose. This is not a man. It is sustenance. It is a gift to the hungry, a reprieve from the breadlines." He then turned away from the body and walked to a small stainless steel table in the corner of the freezer. On it lay a set of freshly cleaned and sharpened tools, their polished surfaces gleaming malevolently in the dim light. He picked up a long, slender boning knife, its blade thin and flexible, designed for separating flesh from bone with surgical precision. He held it for a moment, admiring its balance, its perfect form for its function. The knife was an extension of his will, an instrument of his cold, pragmatic worldview. It was a tool for disassembly, for reducing a complex whole into its marketable, consumable parts. He turned back to Leo, the knife held delicately in his fingers, its pointed tip seeming to gather all the faint light in the room into one brilliant, terrifying point. With a calm, almost paternal expression, Finch stepped toward his apprentice, closing the small distance between them. The frigid air was thick with the promise of violence. He extended his hand, offering the knife to Leo handle first. The gesture was not a threat, but an invitation, a graduation ceremony into a trade far darker than Leo had ever imagined. "Now," Alistair Finch said, his voice a soft, final whisper that cut through the frozen silence. "It is time you learned the most important part of the trade." The implication was absolute. Leo was being offered a choice, to become a butcher or to become the meat, to accept the tool and join the process, or to become the next entry in the ledger, the next body hanging from a hook. The polished steel of the knife reflected Leo's own face, a pale, distorted mask of terror. The handle was cold against his trembling palm, the weight of it both insignificant and impossibly heavy. It was the weight of an unthinkable choice. In his other hand, hidden beneath his apron, he could feel the sharp corners of the ledger, the cold, hard facts of the butcher's long and gruesome career. He was trapped between the documented past and a horrifying future, cornered in a frozen tomb with a monster who saw this moment not as a confrontation, but as a simple, practical lesson in the art of survival. The low hum of the refrigeration unit seemed to grow louder, a monotonous, grinding sound that was counting down the seconds to his decision. In the heart of the city's desperation, inside a small, clean shop that promised salvation, the final transaction was being proposed. The apprentice, holding the tool of the trade, looked from the master to the product, understanding at last the full, horrific cycle of Finch's quality meats. He was standing at the very nexus of life and death, sustenance and slaughter. The world outside, with its breadlines and its quiet despair, had vanished completely. There was only the cold, the silence, and the terrible, gleaming knife. The question of what happened to the city's forgotten souls had been answered. Now, a new question hung in the frozen air, sharper than any blade. What would he do with the answer? The scene was set for the final act of this grotesque play, the master, the apprentice, and the unholy sacrament hanging between them. Alistair Finch watched Leo with an unblinking, patient gaze, confident in the brutal logic of the choice he had presented. In his world, there were only two categories of people, the butchers and the cattle. He had just offered Leo the chance to choose his role. The knife in the boy's hand was more than a weapon. It was a contract, a final exam. Leo's grip tightened on the handle, his knuckles white. The reflection in the blade wavered, his own eyes staring back at him, wide with a terror that was slowly, chillingly, beginning to crystallize into something else, something harder, something sharper. In the frozen eternity of that moment, with the boning knife a cold promise in his hand, Leo's terror found an outlet not in violence, but in pure, animalistic instinct. He did not lunge at Finch. He did not accept the monstrous invitation. Instead, he used the butcher's own workspace against him. With a desperate, primal scream that shattered the tomb-like silence, he shoved the massive, hanging side of beef next to him. The 200 pounds of dead weight swung on its hook like a battering ram, catching Finch squarely in the chest. The butcher, surprised by the chaotic, inefficient movement, staggered backward with a grunt of pain. It was the only opening Leo would get. He dropped the knife, its clatter on the concrete floor a final, sharp punctuation to his apprenticeship, and he ran. He fled the freezer, clutching the cold, heavy ledger to his chest as if it were a shield, and burst through the shop into the indifferent twilight of the Chicago streets, a ghost escaping a mausoleum. His arrival at the 10th District Police Station was a whirlwind of incoherent terror. The desk sergeant, a man named O'Malley whose face was a roadmap of cynicism etched by years of dealing with the city's underbelly, initially dismissed him as another delirious runaway. But Leo's desperation was too raw, too authentic to be ignored. And then there was the ledger. He slammed it onto the counter, the sound echoing in the quiet station house. O'Malley opened it, his expression shifting from bored annoyance to puzzled curiosity, and then to a mask of stony, grim-faced horror. The methodical, handwritten entries, tattered overcoat, 1 shoe, 158 lbs, gray coat, pearl button, 112 lbs, were not the ravings of a mad boy. They were the cold, bureaucratic records of an industrial-scale atrocity, a form of evil so meticulously documented it defied disbelief. Within the hour, 2 squad cars were dispatched to Finch's Quality Meats, their sirens slicing through the night. The scene that greeted the hardened Chicago policeman was one of grotesque cognitive dissonance. The front of the shop was a picture of obsessive cleanliness and order, a small bastion of civic pride. But the back room, and specifically the walk-in freezer, was a descent into a uniquely American hell. The official police report, filed by Detective Miller, noted that 2 officers became physically ill at the sight of the hanging body, a man later identified as a local dock worker named Thomas Dolan. The juxtaposition of human remains alongside animal carcasses, all treated with the same dispassionate, professional preparation, was a violation of some fundamental human taboo. The discovery of human tissue residue in the meat grinders and bone fragments clogging the floor drain confirmed the unspeakable. The shop was not just a crime scene, it was a factory, a place where the city's forgotten were the raw material for a horrifying finished product. When the story broke, it did not just shock the city, it poisoned it from the inside out. The Chicago Tribune's headline, "The Butcher of Packingtown," gave the horror a name, and the details that followed induced a collective, citywide retch. The very act of eating became suspect, tainted by a monstrous possibility. Families who had celebrated Finch's special cuts, who had praised their richness and texture, were consumed by a wave of revulsion so profound it felt like a physical illness. Neighbors would later testify to seeing people vomiting in the gutters, overcome by the realization of what they had so gratefully consumed. The salvation offered by Finch's quality meats was revealed to be a communion of the damned, a feast where the hungry, in their desperation, had unknowingly devoured their own. The entire neighborhood felt implicated, their plates and stomachs now extensions of a crime scene they had helped to enable. Beneath the public outrage lay a deeper, more corrosive layer of communal guilt. The residents of Packingtown were forced to confront a terrible truth about themselves. They had been willfully blind. They had seen the desperate faces of the hobos and the street orphans, and they had looked away. They had noticed their quiet disappearances and had told themselves it was simply the way of the world in these hard times. Alistair Finch had not operated in a vacuum. He had thrived in an ecosystem of indifference. His monstrous logic, that society had already discarded these people, was a dark reflection of a sentiment that many held but dared not speak. The horror of his actions was matched only by the shame of their own passive complicity, the quiet, unacknowledged relief that it was someone else's child, someone else's father, who had vanished from the breadlines. The architect of this horror, Alistair Finch, was never brought to justice. When the police raided his shop, he was gone. A manhunt was launched, but the man who had been a fixture of the community for years vanished without a trace, melting back into the anonymous crowds from which he had so carefully selected his victims. Some believed he had taken his own life, while others whispered that he had simply moved to another city, another hungry town, to open another shop under a new name. His disappearance was his final, cruel masterpiece. By evading capture, he denied the city a neat resolution, a final accounting. He remained a ghost, a question mark, a fact that allowed his story to bleed from the pages of history into the darker, more enduring ink of urban legend, ensuring he would haunt the city's memory forever. Finch's quality meats was sealed, a permanent monument to the atrocities committed within. It was never sold, never repurposed, and never torn down. The building was left to decay, becoming a wound on the face of the neighborhood that refused to heal. For years, the windows remained boarded, the paint peeled, and the brickwork crumbled, but its presence was more powerful in its dereliction than it ever was in its prime. It became a site of morbid fascination, a place where children would dare each other to touch the rotting doorframe, whispering the name that had replaced Alistair Finch in the local lexicon. The building itself seemed to hold a memory of the crimes, and locals swore that on hot, humid summer nights, you could still catch a faint, sickly sweet odor emanating from the foundations, a ghostly scent of the secrets buried beneath. Over the decades, the historical facts of the case began to soften and warp, eroded by time and retelling. The name of the brave apprentice, Leo, was largely forgotten. The precise number of victims recorded in the ledger became an exaggerated, unknowable figure. The complex social conditions of the Great Depression that had allowed such a monster to flourish were simplified into a generic backdrop for a campfire tale. What remained was the pure, distilled horror of the story's core, a kind butcher who made the most delicious meat from the people nobody missed. The man, Alistair Finch, ceased to be a historical figure and was reborn as a mythological one, an American boogeyman known only as the Butcher of Packingtown, a story used to frighten children into coming home before dark. The legend of the Butcher of Packingtown became a permanent, dark fixture in the folklore of Chicago, a chilling parable about the thin veneer of civilization. It serves as a gruesome reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural phantoms, but ordinary men who find a cold, rational logic for their own depravity. The story endures because it touches upon a primal fear, that in times of great desperation, the sacred lines that separate us The consumer from the consumed, the neighbor from the raw material, can be erased with terrifying ease. Finch's shop was a microcosm of a society that had begun to devour itself, and his ledger was the final, honest accounting of the cost of looking away from the suffering of the invisible and the discarded. The darkest chapters of our history are often hidden in plain sight, preserved not in official texts, but in the chilling folklore that echoes through generations. These stories are more than just tales to tell in the dark. They are the archives of our collective shadows, stark warnings of the horrors that can fester beneath the surface of the everyday. They remind us that the line between a savior and a monster can be as thin as a butcher's blade. To ensure that these grim chronicles are never erased by time, and that the memories of the forgotten are given a permanent voice, subscribe and help us preserve the archive of the shadows.